election of Barack Obama not so much terrified conservatives as mystified them. And for Democrats and liberals who were excited about his election, I think they're becoming mystified as well. What do I mean by that? The first obvious fact is that Americans usually do not elect Northern liberal senators as their presidents, or for that matter, Northern liberal anything, not since John Kennedy. But of course, John Kennedy in 1960 ran on a platform of a missile gap, tougher defense than the Eisenhower administration, and a tax cut. And then subsequent Northern liberal politicians, whether they were George McGovern, or Walter Mondale, or Michael Dukakis, or John Kerry, just simply didn't get elected. The three Democratic senators and office holders who were made president, elected to president, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton, all had a Southern accent. And even Al Gore, who won the popular vote in the year 2000, had a Southern accent, which suggests that the American people do not trust Democrats to be president unless they can be convinced that they're Southern and thereby at least moderate, if not conservative. Okay, so Barack Obama did the unthinkable. He was a Northern liberal who got elected. How did that happen? Well, a number of reasons. Let's look at it as a perfect storm, so to speak. A, this was an orphaned election. 2008, there was not an incumbent vice president, there was not an incumbent president. That had not happened since 1952, when Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower ran and Harry Truman was not up for re-election. When that happens, sometimes you have two candidates running against the incumbent, and it seems to hurt the incumbent if he's in your party. What I mean by that is that John McCain was running against George Bush, and so was Barack Obama, and that helped Barack Obama much more than it helped John McCain. Second, John McCain and Sarah Palin were ahead of Barack Obama and Joe Biden until September 15th, 2008. Then we had the great Wall Street meltdown, the crash of the stock market, and lo and behold, a 4-point lead almost evaporated overnight, partly due to Obama's skill in reacting to the crisis versus John McCain's inept responses. But nevertheless, that lead dissipated, and people woke up a week later, and Barack Obama had a 3 to 5 point lead that he never relinquished. There was other reasons before. The novelty of having the first African-American president intrigued a lot of people, intrigued a lot of moderate conservatives who otherwise might not have voted for Barack Obama. We don't know quite how that factor played in the election, except it did probably play to the advantage of Barack Obama. He ran as a moderate. Remember, he said that it was unpatriotic that George Bush had run up these 150, 200, $300 billion deficits for 2, 3, 4 years in a row. And of course, John McCain did not run an inspired campaign. He was over 70 years old, and it didn't seem to most Americans that he really wanted to win. He didn't have fire in the belly. All of that in perfect storm fashion explained the inexplicable, how a Northern liberal became president. But this was very important because it really hadn't happened, and therefore a lot of other things haven't happened. For the first time, we can see the ideology that's the underpinning of Barack Obama, and indeed the whole liberal imagination. Forget whether he wanted to close down a Boeing plant, forget whether he wanted to have nationalized health care, forget about reset and reaching out to Iran. Look at the ideologies that fuel or drive these manifestations. And what are they? Well, there are a lot of ways of thinking that are not in the mainstream of American life. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense at all. What I mean is they're usually found in the philosophy department, the government department of a university, the law school, the graduate school, or the foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Ford Foundation. Sometimes they're found in Hollywood, sometimes they're found in the media, but they're not the stuff of broad popular culture and institutions that resonate with most Americans. And the result of this is that we see them for the first time out in the public sphere, and we can adjudicate them in a way that would never have been possible had Barack Obama not been elected. What are the elements of this Obama philosophy? I would call it generically postmodernism. That's a fancy term, postmodernism. Post is a Latin prefix that means after, and modernism is, of course, modern. After modernism. If we were reading poetry, we'd say traditional poetry, it has rhyme, it has a particular vocabulary, it goes back to the Greeks. If we say Modern poetry is T.S. Eliot or Wallace Stevens. It doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to break the sentence at the end of a particular hexameter or iambic pentameter. There is no meter. What is a postmodern? It's after modernism. It might be anything. You might throw ink on the page and say that's a poem. You could have 2 words, and that's a poem. If we were to look at art, we know that classical art from Greece and Rome, what it is. We know what traditional landscape painting is. We know what the Northern and Southern Renaissance painting is. That's a Rembrandt. But when we look at modernism, a Picasso, it doesn't have to represent what the eye sees. It's impressionistic, in other words. But what is postmodern? Postmodern says, I reject the rejection of classicism. I reject all of your forms. I can urinate in a bottle, and that is art. I can throw excrement up on the canvas. That is art. I reject everything. Now, when we apply this way of thinking after modernism to politics, it says, I am not bound by empiricism, absolute truth, Republican and Democratic politics. I'll give you an example. In the old binary, if you were a conservative, you said, we need to have a war against terror. We need to have Guantanamo. We need to have renditions. We need to have tribunals. We need to have predators. We need to have preventive detention. If you're a liberal, you say, no, we don't really need these. These are trampling the Constitution. If you're a postmodernist and you really don't believe in absolute truth, or you really don't believe that there are facts, or you believe that reality is predicated on people with power, and that people that don't have it create an alternate reality, and your reality is no more valid than anybody else's reality. There are no rules of art, there are no rules of painting. Then you say, we can't have Guantanamo, but we'll have Guantanamo. We're not going to have renditions, we're not going to have tribunals, but we're going to have them. Predators are assassinations from the sky, but we're going to quintuple them. Or if you want to look at the economics of postmodernism, you say the following. Fat cat bankers, 1%. Sometimes you made them enough money. Now is not time to profit, but you go to Martha's Vineyard. Or your first family goes to Vail or Aspen or Costa del Sol. Or you're the biggest Wall Street recipient of Wall Street cash in history. Or you're the first presidential candidate in the history of campaign financing to renounce it. Why? Because there are no rules. You simply create a reality by your position itself, and it's no more or no less valid than any other reality. You're not bound by logic or consistency or prior position. You make it up as it goes because that is no more or no less value than an empirical, abstract basis of fact. That's postmodernism, and I think we have the first postmodern president. But there are other corollaries to it that also explain the Obama phenomenon that I think will be a catharsis to the American public or a dream for some of its supporters. The next element I would call utopian pacifism. Remember, utopia doesn't mean good place, it means no place. It's the imagination of something that can't exist, a perfect world. Pacifism is another nice Latin word for meaning calm. Pacific Ocean is calmer than the Atlantic. You don't want trouble. The utopian says that there are ways to create a world without war. It is a reenactment of the Rousseauian vision that man is born wonderful and he's corrupted by his family, by his parents, by his government, by his religion. Otherwise, he'd be not savage at all. He's a noble savage. And in the utopian pacifist mind, George Bush created most of the problems in the world today. There were not innate tensions over religion or resources or pride or envy or all the Thucydidean emotions that make people want to fight. You're in a suburb and one guy has a property line and one guy has leaves that grow across it, they fight. The utopian says they don't need to. They're just not educated enough, or they're not wealthy enough, or they didn't have enough rules because they're calm, rational actors. And if you see the utopian pacifism manifested in reality, and you do, thank God, under this administration for the first time, you start to see how it works. That the problem with Iran isn't that it's a failed state or it's a radical Shiite version of Islam, which is itself getting more fundamentalist and more radical, or that it wants a bomb for prestige that it can't otherwise garner by its GDP or its art or its literature, or it has an innate hatred of Israel, but that it's misunderstood. Or it was treated badly in the past, the way we treated Mossadegh in 1953. And therefore, we can reset with Iran. For 4 or 5 occasions, we can talk with them. We can give them deadlines that they don't have to be met. We can reach out. We can talk about why innately there's no logical reason that they should be mad at Israel. If you look at North Korea, we can adjudicate North Korea. We can say there doesn't make any sense that you would like a bomb. When Barack Obama first came into office, he said in an interview to El Arabia, my middle name, my father's heritage, this will resonate with you. And there's been times in the past when the United States has not resonated with you. And so we have this utopian pacifistic strain now. We just heard in recent times that the administration is floating a unilateral build-down of nuclear weapons. We don't need 5,000, we don't need 1,700, we don't need the 1,500 that are adjudicated with the Russians. After all, if we were to disarm and go down to 300 or 400 or even lower, the other countries would respond in kind. They wouldn't want nukes. They would follow our example of being logical and kind and humane. So in other words, the utopian pacifist doesn't like these ancient Neanderthal ideas like deterrence and balance of power and alliances. If I, being a Neanderthal, would say to Barack Obama, but wait, if you unilaterally disarm, human nature being what it is, people will think you're weak, not magnanimous. And what are you going to tell Japan and Taiwan and Germany and South Korea that don't have nuclear weapons? That you can't protect them now? They'll get nuclear weapons, and there'll be more nuclear weapons than there was before we disarmed or built down. That doesn't register with a utopian pacifist, because as a postmodernist, these old rules don't apply. There's another element that's very interesting. I would call it moral equivalence. Moral equivalence says that a felony is equal to a misdemeanor, or perhaps better stated, that we in the West have to be perfect to be good. The moral equivalent thinker, as a postmodernist, does not necessarily look at facts or the magnitude of particular facts, but makes rough equivalent generalizations. I'll give you an example. This administration came into power and immediately harangued Israel about settlements. It did not say, you are a constitutional government, you have freedom of speech, 1 million Arabs have the exercise the right to vote in the way that Jews cannot in Cairo or Damascus or in Baghdad. They were ethnically cleansed. It wasn't equivalent. The moral equivalence is, doesn't matter. Israel has occupied land and therefore they were culpable. And you say, well, wait a minute. Nicosia, Cyprus is occupied. The Sakhalin Islands, let's discuss it. No. We, being Western powers, have a greater culpability, and it's the misdemeanor is equivalent to the felony. Barack Obama goes to Turkey. We know one modern state has a wretched record of genocide. The Turks, in the last century, butchered over 1 million Armenians. They have persecuted the Kurds for 50 years, and they ethnically cleansed 1 million Greeks to such a degree they drove them into the Aegean Sea in the siege of Smyrna in 1922. And yet Barack Obama chose to go to Turkey to apologize about American treatment of Native Americans. I don't think anybody today who looks at a Native American in the United States could say that his position is equal to an Armenian in Turkey or a Kurd in Turkey. And yet they're equivalent because we suffered a misdemeanor and they committed a felony. Moral equivalence is a postmodern attribute because it's not subject to inquiry and facts and contra-evidence. There's a couple of other ones that are just important as utopian pacifism and moral equivalence. It's what I call multiculturalism. That's the idea that each particular culture, and there are many of them, are equal to one and another. So the United States is not exceptional. I'm not saying that myself, I'm paraphrasing Barack Obama. He said we're exceptional to the degree that Greece thinks that it's exceptional, that Britain thinks that it's exceptional. You want to say, wait a minute. We create 1/4 of the world's goods and services. We only have 300 million people. 300 million people create 3 times as much goods and services as 3 times the population in China. One American is 3 times more productive in the decay of the United States than China is in its ascendancy. That's exceptional. The United States helped win World War I and World War II. The United States creates the most Nobel Prize winner. It's exceptional. We could go on and on. But if you don't believe in American exceptionalism or empirical data, you just say that who is to judge another country? It's not just worse or better, it's just different. It's just different. So Barack Obama immediately upon entry of the presidency said that there's things the United States has done to the Arab world that are problematic. And I thought to myself, what would they be? Would it be trying to feed the Somalis who were starving when they were killing each other? Would it be going into Kuwait and saving it from Muslims Iraq? Would it be going into Afghanistan and saving it for the Russians? Would it be trying to save the Muslim Chechens from the Second Chechen War where they were almost destroyed? Would it be speaking out on behalf of the Palestinians after the Gulf War when the Kuwaitis ethnically cleansed 300,000 Palestinians from Kuwait? And we said, don't do that. Would it be giving about the same amount of foreign aid per year to Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinians as we did to Israel? No. We are culpable in a way that China's not culpable, where you can't even recite a prayer in public in many Chinese provinces. Notice too that when we start to talk about these things, the burden of the United States is not the burden of Russia, is not the burden of Europe, is not the burden of China, is not the burden of Africa, is not the burden of Latin America. It is much greater than all of these other alternate systems included. That's what the multiculturalist believes. Now, there's one wrinkle to it that's very important. The multiculturalist, as a postmodernist, does not believe in reality. So, when Barack Obama, when we were talking about postmodernism at the very beginning, when he really does believe that the Wall Street 1%, the corporate jet owners are suspect, or they're unkind, or they need to pay their fair share, it does not mean you wouldn't want to live next to them and wouldn't want to fly on the 747. It wouldn't mean that you didn't want to go to Costa del Sol if you're the first family. So by the same token, when you say the United States is just one of many, it doesn't mean you really want to live that way. When Americans who are multiculturalists go abroad to study the West Bank, they stay in hotels in Israel. When they go to Africa, they bring a bag of uniquely Western or uniquely American antibiotics. They have sunglasses that are made out of Western products. So it's a sort of multiculturalism of the mind that you would not take seriously in fact. There's another element to multiculturalism that's part of this postmodern cargo. And that's what I call the notion of race. You could call it crassly affirmative action, you could call it more nobly multiracialism, multiculturalism, but this notion that race separates us. And given, it's obviously does, given the tragic history of race in the United States, but it's this notion that intermarriage, integration, assimilation, which are occurring at record levels, still do not transcend racial differences. And so once you go down that route of judging people by their outward appearance rather than the content of their character, it leads nowhere. I'll give you an example. The country is fascinated by Jeremy Lin, the second generation Christian, Harvard-educated Taiwanese basketball sensation. In fact, they're so fascinated that it has become a racial issue, because usually Harvard's graduates are Asian Americans or Christian Americans are not the type of people you associate with extraordinary physical prowess in the basketball sphere. And so heavyweight champion Floyd Mayweather said, this is unfair. Blacks do what Lin does every day and they don't get credit. Well, of course they don't, because he's unusual. There's not a lot of black golfers, so Tiger Woods got credit in a way that people didn't. There wasn't a president like Barack Obama before. There had not been a Harvard Law Review editor. So we're so obsessed with race that we don't understand that attention always goes for the exception. Whether Jeremy Lin fails or succeeds will ultimately adjudicate whether we still think of him, just as we're not thinking of Tiger Woods so much anymore as we once did, because his golf game isn't what it was. So this obsession with race has almost warped all of the other considerations of what makes one unique and what makes one not unique. And once you go down that route, as I said earlier, of predicating one's performance or one's essence as racial, and race being not incidental to character but essential, then you open a Pandora's box, the postmodernist does. And think for a minute what's happened with our first post-racial, supposedly transracial presidents. We have an attorney general. In testimony for the Congress, he referred to African Americans as my people. Can you imagine anybody else doing that? You think somebody who believed in moral equivalence would say, well, gosh, I don't want John Ashcroft to do that. He said that the United States was collectively a cowardly nation because they didn't accept racial terminology or discussions or conversations on his terms. he had a bad day in a Senate and Congressional House of Representatives hearing about the so-called Fast and Furious scandal. What did he say? That this was due to racial prejudice against African Americans. What did the president himself say during the campaign? He said he wanted to put race behind us. How could he put race behind us? It was always essential to his character. And so he said typical white person. Or he said people in Pennsylvania who were working class whites cling to their guns. Or he sat with Reverend Wright, who was an abject racist and anti-Semite in his congregation for 20 years. Or he went as president down to the border and said to a Latino population, let's punish our enemies. All of these are accentuating racial differences, and you have to, once you go down that road that race is essential to who you are. So when we talk about Barack Obama, people will say he was the first person to be an editor of the Harvard Law Review who was African American. Nobody says he was the first editor who was African American who published an article. It doesn't matter what your actual accomplishments were because they're incidental. And so now that we have had the president inject race as something essential, we're trapped in that prism. And to discuss actual accomplishment outside of race will either to be evoke racism, people will say you're racist, or people say you're not sensitive enough to include race in a conversation. Let me summarize what I'm getting at. Usually people with postmodernist ideas would not be president of the United States. Postmodernism is a philosophical, all-encompassing system of thought that at its most basic says there is no reality, that people with power create the rules and they call them quote-unquote fair. We come along and we reject that system, and we're not bound by consistency, we're not bound by empiricism. So overseas we don't accept the left idea that necessarily we're imperialistic and bad, or the right idea that there's such things as deterrence or balance of power. As we go along, we do various things that can be, we can keep Guantanamo open and we can say that we want to close it, and they're not mutually exclusive. In the moral equivalent fashion, we can find that the fact that Israel is a democratic republic does not mean much in relation to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are just different. We don't really adjudicate people by finite notions, absolute notions of democratic or consensual, given our privileged position of people who hold power. When we look at utopian pacifisms, we say we reject the notion of a Neanderthal world where people don't act unless they can act. In other words, we don't say that what keeps the peace is that fear that if you invade a country, the consequences will be such that you won't. In other words, we say instead, you are nice, you're educated, you're trained, you're well-fed, you have plenty of resources, therefore there's no logical need to cause trouble, therefore because we understand there's no logical need, there won't be any trouble. That's a utopian pacifist idea. And when we get to race, we start to establish notions that what we look like and who we are, this is very postmodern, is supposed to transcend race. So we are going to say that we're going to lead to a trans post-racial society by emphasizing the way we look. And the result is chaos. That we can't appreciate a Jeremy Lin as an extraordinary athlete. We either have to ask ourselves, is he a minority? Is he Asian? Is he unfair to blacks? Is this not fair? Blacks don't get credit in the NFL or the NBA commiserate with their actual achievements. And then somebody comes up and says, well, wait a minute. The NFL is 70% African American. The NBA is 76% African American. Are they overrepresented? Why are Asians that are UC Berkeley who are 50% have to have de facto quotas to eliminate their participation down to what they are proportionally represented in the population, and yet we don't apply those same things to the NFL or the NBA because it's chaos. Because once you go down the postmodern route of thinking, there are no facts, there are no consistencies. It's just simply whoever has power is suspect, and I'm going to create an alternate reality based on my more noble position as one who's exploited and victimized rather than one who victimizes and exploits. To sum up, the election of Barack Obama was a unique occasion. For all of us, whether you agree with what he's doing or disagree, it'll be a cathartic experience. For the first time, we will see ideologies and patterns and methods of thought that were relegated to the media or to Hollywood or to the university, and they're going to be mainstream tools by which to remake the United States. It'll be an interesting ride.